QAnon conspiracy theories have plagued this country since the first post on social media in 2017. Believers of such conspiracy theories number in the millions in the U.S. alone, and these theories form the basis for support of Donald Trump and many of his followers. The Trump family, including Donald and Eric, have retweeted QAnon posts, and one of its most prominent supporters, Marjorie Taylor Greene, now occupies a seat in Congress. Many of these conspiracists intersect significantly with white Christian nationalists, who form an extremist movement that believes that the U.S. has always been a Christian nation and always should be. Many members of this broader ideology believe that they should wage spiritual warfare to make the nation more godly. They see themselves as righteous warriors in a cosmic battle between God and Satan, good and evil. The attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021, reportedly featured thousands of these spiritual warriors, who also intersect with white supremacy groups such as the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the Three Percenters. So what do these conspiracists have to do with 16th-century wars of religion in France? And what does the doctrine of the lesser magistrate from pre-modern France during this time period have to do with white Christian nationalism and its conspiracists? In the first episode of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota, we welcome Anna Rosensweig from the University of Rochester to help us explore these questions and more. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Ahearne-Kroll, and this is the Future of the Past Lab, the podcast where we rethink the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. So let's get into the meat of your book, Subjects of Affection. So in that book, you draw upon Huguenot resistance theories as a main part of your argument. For those of us who are unfamiliar with these theories, can you talk about what they are and why you found them so useful for your work?
Absolutely. So Huguenot, first the term Huguenot, for those who don't know, is a term used to describe Protestants in France or Protestants from France in the 16th and then into the 17th and 18th centuries. So Huguenot resistance theories are political treatises, sometimes pamphlets, that were written by Protestants, usually influenced by either explicitly or implicitly by Calvin, that were elaborating very detailed, complicated, and specific ways that Protestants could resist the monarchy. So the monarchy at this time in the 16th century is Catholic, and there's lots of different Protestant Catholic factions, but it became, because at that time people were so concerned with the crime of regicide, of killing the king, that was thought to be really, really bad. And so Protestants wanted to find a way to justify situations in which you could resist, and in some cases, in some extreme cases, even kill the king, without coming across as anarchists or more radical than they actually were.
Interesting. So this was just as much a religious struggle as it was a political struggle.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so the Huguenots developed these theories as a way of resisting the political and religious power that Protestants felt at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And it had to do with the question of tyranny. And so at the time, it was thought that to resist a king who was a good king was not okay, and to resist a king who had become a tyrant or a king who got into power in an unauthorized way, that was okay. And one mark of tyranny at the time was violations of liberty of conscience or a kind of internal freedom. And that is very much comes from theological understandings of, the interior self, of liberty that come out of Calvin. So it's this conjunction of religion and politics that in ways that at the time I think wouldn't have been thought of as separate. And that's one of the reasons I'm interested in it, is that built-in constitutive conjunction.
Yeah. So at this point and this might be beyond your book, but at this point in Catholic thinking along these lines, what are some of the differences between Protestant thinking on interior freedom and conscience and Catholics?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think theologically that is a bit above my pay grade. But I can talk about the reception of these treatises and these ideas by Catholics.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, so Catholics read these treatises and thought, this is actually much more radical than the Protestants are saying. So from the Protestant perspective, it was only, not just anyone could resist a tyrant, even though anyone could feel a violation of their liberty. Most people who were just, regular private people had to appeal to a public official, what is sometimes called a lesser magistrate, who has a role already in the bureaucratic structure. And then from there, go higher and higher up the chain of resistance. And Catholics read these and thought, actually, the way that this is structured, it really says that anyone can resist the king, even up to the point of regicide. And so they started writing similar treatises in response that were much more explicitly radical. And that became really handy when trying to decide whether to say this in French or English, whether Henri IV, Henry IV, becomes king because he's Protestant. And he does convert to Catholicism, and then he converts back, and then he converts back. But when he first takes when it first looks like he's going to be the one on the throne, all of a sudden resistance to tyrannical monarchy becomes important to Catholics in the way that it had been important to Protestants.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in your book, you deal with Antigone and Oedipus as ruling characters that are swayed by affective influence, which is a big part of your book as well. Can you talk us through that part of your argument and the way that you use affect theory and emotion in your book?
Yeah. So this is in part related to the Catholic reception of the Protestant theories, where they said, this very limited idea of a lesser magistrate or a public official, actually it becomes much broader. And I think one of the ways that it becomes broad is through affect, is through ideas of emotion and the ways that an emotional response to a leader can lead to political legitimacy for that leader. And so built into these resistance theories and resistance treatises are this idea that if the regular public official who's already in place doesn't do what he is supposed to do, then the people feel disappointment and they can basically turn to someone else. And the way that the treatises talk about, that movement from one leader to another person, they track political legitimacy through this question of affect. Does the person inspire joy? Do they inspire disappointment, anger, things like that? And that, to me, there's a real direct connection between what's going on with affect in the political treatises and then what we see in tragic drama, whether or not it's staged or even in the text itself. You can see, I think theater is sort of the genre where you can really see characters being influenced by each other through reason, through arguments, but also through the emotions that they're eliciting in each other, and then also in the audience, or in some cases a chorus, whoever else is on stage.
How did you find that connection between the political and the theatrical?
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't have thought to put those two together, but how does that work?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, and I think I really lucked out. So the way that it actually happened was a bit backwards. And so I had started a project about the role of affect in 17th-century French theater. And I was also interested in questions of human rights and the role of affect and questions of political rights in French theater. And I became really frustrated because I felt like a lot of the work in law and literature, the sort of subfield of law and literature, and a lot of the discussion about literature and theater and human rights as they were elaborated around the French Revolution in the 18th century seemed to really focus on the individual, like a very specific rights of the individual. And that to me seemed like it was only getting at part of what was going on in this earlier moment on the stage, where in those treatises I was seeing a relationship between the individual's rights, like the liberty of conscience, and broader collective rights. And this way that they weren't two distinct things that were held together. They were sort of the same thing, and one would come to the fore and then another one would recede into the background. And the way that those concepts related to each other was through this question of affect. And so then I was I was dissatisfied with the kind of, theoretical or political frames for the questions I had and the objects, the actual text that I was reading. And then I came across this idea of the right of resistance. And it turns out it was a whole thing. It was a whole thing in the 16th century in this French tradition. And I just hadn't encountered it as a 17th centuryist, in part because of the way that the field was constructed. So it's very much some people are 16th centuryists, some people are 17th centuryists. And we make that dividing line for a few reasons, because France likes divisions, and 100, a century is a nice round number, but also because that turn of the century marked the end of the wars of religion. So the idea in French studies is really 16th century, time of conflict and war, and 17th century is a time of not exactly peace, but about a stronger monarchy that implements order. And so all these complicated ideas about the liberty of conscience and who can resist and when, really, we don't see them operating as explicitly. And so part of the premise of my book was there's this older concept from the 16th century that we don't explicitly see in the 17th century, but it has this sort of muted afterlife that's more attenuated in different places. And the place I most explicitly look at it is through drama. And so then when so that was all during the dissertation where I was sort of like, I really lucked out that there's this historical concept that helps me see what's going on, explain what's going on. And then for the book, I was able to do a lot of research about these resistance theories and really build out that connection.
Yeah.
So I really got lucky.
No, it's great. And that oftentimes happens with interdisciplinary work.
Exactly.
And it's, weird to think about 16th century and 17th century as interdisciplinary, but if there's that dividing line, breaking down those dividing lines can really yield interesting work like the one, you came up with.
Exactly.
So that's great.
Yeah.
I think you've answered the question of resistance theories and affect theories and how they intertwine, but this kind of gets at a question that I think we're going to talk about tomorrow. But and it's another question I had about thinking about the challenges of interpreting texts or cultural phenomenon from other parts of history to study very different cultural contexts, even if there are crossovers. How do you account for the differences in culture? How do you account for instance, the idea of the individual in ancient Greece was very different than the idea of the individual in 17th century France. So how do you use a work from like Antigone, for instance, in thinking about 17th century France when the cultural categories are so different?
Yeah, that's really complicated. And I think in some ways it's a really interesting methodological question and one that has some risk to it. So I think the Antigone example is a good one because in the 16th and 17th century in France, there were versions of the Antigone written. Some based on Sophocles, and then some based on, some pulling from other sources. And there were plays produced that also had the name Antigone, but they tell the story in a very different way. And so the Sophocles starts with, it's the third part of the trilogy, right? I'm now all of a sudden very aware that I'm talking to a classicist, and so I'm getting a little bit nervous.
I'm not a classicist either. So,
okay, well, I'm the chair of a department of classics, among other things. But so the Sophocles play that, we as 21st century scholars are culturally infused with starts at the moment when Antigone is going to bury her brother. The 16th and 17th century versions in France start with Antigone leading her father around in the wilderness. So it's pulling together, parts of the trilogy that are separated out into different plays in terms of how we've received those. And I think that's interesting, not just because the story arc is different, but because for me, it enabled me to see Antigone as a figure who's really, really deeply affected by familial ties, which is not absent from the reception of Antigone, the Sophocles Antigone, but it can be, she becomes, I think, less portable of a character, less abstractable as a character. So looking at differences like that across time, I think have been helpful. I think making this issue part of what one is studying, like instead of in the background of the work, but to bring it to the fore. So another example from my book is, I was reading on the one hand contemporary affect theory and then reading these political treatises who didn't use the word affect in the way that we would now, but they used, affection, or they would use sentiment, or they would use feeling. And of course, along the way, I learned, okay, there's a whole subfield in the history of emotions. And I think the question becomes, at any given moment, does one do the work of disambiguation or ambiguation, or do you do one in order to get back to the other? And so there's a moment in my book where I say I'm using these interchangeably, acknowledging that they're not really interchangeable for everyone. But in order to work trans-historically, I think some of that, I want to say fuzziness or imprecision, because I don't think it's exactly that. I think it's sort of like awareness of moments of continuity and rupture.
Yeah.
Or, I'm really interested in how what looks like rupture has some continuity to it.
Right.
And vice versa.
Yeah. So just to clarify, I'm a biblical studies
person. I'm really sorry.
That's fine. But in the history of interpretation of the Bible, you look at rabbinic works that discuss stories in the Hebrew Bible, they never discuss the things that are clear. They always, look for the gaps in the text or the ambiguities in the text and do that great stuff that they do with midrash or just telling other stories to fill in the gaps. And this idea of you have to come up with one interpretation is a really recent idea, and it's really not part of the tradition. And the fact that the classical tradition in France is continued with newer editions of great plays that have made it through the years is an example of that. That rewriting of the plays just seems a process of interpretation rather than just
absolutely
plain creation. So,
absolutely, yeah. And what at that moment was, what were the hard questions? Yeah. I think, another thing that became really interesting to me was in the 16th and 17th century, Creon wasn't obviously a tyrant the way he is when we read it now. It was a real, because who was a tyrant and in which case can you do something about that tyranny was so, ever present in a way that hasn't been for us, although maybe it's starting to be again. Don't want to jump the gun on the other stuff, but the more recent parts of my work. But it makes sense that that's not at the foreground of our, modern, for lack of a better word, thinking about Antigone.
Yeah. Well, this is a good segue into
tyranny.
The questions that are coming up in your newest work. So one of your current projects is very relevant to what we're doing in Exploring Assumptions, but also in the Future of the Past Lab, which talks about Christian nationalism. So can you talk about your project and how Christian nationalists are using early modern documents, literature, or cultural conventions and concepts that you have studied?
Yeah, this is another thing that developed through an accident of research, I think, as so often happens. But I was looking for an English translation of a German text that was used by a lot of these French Huguenot writers. And I don't have German, unfortunately, in any real way. And it was initially written in Latin, and my Latin is not at all where it should be. So I wanted an English translation as a starting point. And I found one, but one that it turns out was commissioned by an evangelical far-right extremist pastor in Wisconsin.
Wow.
And I thought, this is interesting. And he writes about, so this text is called the Magdeburg Confession. It's a group of pastors, in Magdeburg who are resisting attempted imposition of Catholic rule. And the reason that he commissioned this translation was because he thought that this text and other Protestant treatises were really important for the activist work he was doing as an anti-abortionist. And that is very different from my perspective in a lot of ways, but the fact that we were both looking for a translation, and then his was the one that was, commissioned, and that was sort of my access point, was just really disturbing, but also fascinating to me. And then I very quickly found out that he had also, based on the Magdeburg Confession and these French texts, written his own book called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate. And the subtitle is escaping me at this moment, but it really is about, hey, there's this early modern concept invented by Protestants, Whether or not that's true is a whole other thing. But, for him, invented by Protestants, that is integral to also the founding of America, and that we should be and have an obligation to be activating now in the contemporary United States. So that's how I got there. And I'll talk about him more, later in the week.
So kind of tied into what we were just talking about, where the idea of older documents or older cultural concepts being adapted and adopted in a different cultural context, where we as scholars are really careful about doing that. Mm-hmm. What was your experience of this pastor's use of these hundreds of years old documents and concepts to fit his own sort of cultural context?
Yeah, that has really changed over time. So initially, I was very focused on pointing out the ways in which he had abstracted these texts from their context, and how the gap between that context and our current one in the United States was quite different. For example, it's not a monarchy in the United States right now, right? So there's all these other democratic mechanisms for expressing displeasure and resisting that he wasn't taking into account. So yeah, that became very interesting to me. But then the more time that I spent with his interpretations of the text, the more I realized that I actually think his interpretations of them are fine. They're historically abstracted, but they're not completely. He's an okay reader of these texts. In similar ways to the Catholics, which he would not like being compared to Catholics, but in similar ways to the Catholics in the 16th century, he has a more radical interpretation of them, but it's one that I think is available in the text. And that was disturbing, in part because I realized I have such an attachment to these texts, not just as an object of study, but like something. Friends is too strong. I think I have people who are friends, but I don't know. It was just something that they had been in my life for a long time, and I had been thinking of them as, because they have this individual collective rights conjunction that is so different from our modern one. I was sort of hoping on some level, wow, this would be really helpful for those of us on the left, which I'm very open about being, to think about collective action in different ways. And so in some ways I felt like I got scooped and by someone who was able to do it, in part because I think some of his political commitments are actually much closer to the French Huguenots than mine are. And I started thinking about who would Calvin be more comfortable using his texts? I think not me.
Yeah.
I think not me. And I don't think we're limited by what Calvin would like or would not like.
Yeah.
But that really complicated my initial impulse to point out the historical inaccuracies. And that has driven a lot of my research now and my thinking now. What are these ways that these texts are being mobilized? And not only how are they being taken out of context, but in which ways does then recontextualizing them help us understand what's going on? There's a kind of, it's become more like a historical loop of thinking than a sort of, here's one narrative and here's the full narrative. I just became very dissatisfied with pointing out all the ways that he was wrong.
Yeah.
And he's wrong about a lot of things. I don't want to give him too much credit, but.
So how does he, when he uses these texts, does he assume a certain authority for them, or are these just ideas that he is using to formulate his own perspective on the world and what his circle of people should be doing?
When you say authority, do you mean that it has maybe not like the Bible or the Constitution, but it has a kind of force like that?
Yeah, exactly. These aren't just random ideas that he found somewhere, but they have some sort of authority, some sort of continuity of authority from Protestant resistance to monarchy all the way up to the present. And now he's recapturing that power of the original documents, or the string of authority that has gone from that point to this point, or
yes.
How do you read what he's doing there?
Yes, I think it's that. I think that he sees them as very authoritative, but authoritative in a way that Protestants over time have lost sight of. And so he, on the one hand, traces a sort of dubious lineage from these texts to the early America to now the contemporary United States. And I say dubious because it has, it's rough around the edges, but it has some, I think, veracity to it. But he's saying that we don't see that continuity there because at different moments, pastors and their flocks have lost sight of them. And so either their influence dropped away because of other ideas that were more popular or more worldly, or translations weren't available anymore. Like, he has this way of saying this is a part of our God-given heritage as Protestants, part of our, he wouldn't use the term, but intellectual history, but that we've forgotten about. And so we need to revitalize it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think investing legitimacy in those texts as like a forgotten part of a lineage of an intellectual lineage that can be claimed by him and his followers, I think is really key for him.
So the legitimacy comes. So is his use of these texts a postscript or a prescript for action? I mean, it seems like, it's a fine line between reading what you want to do into a text or finding justification for what you want to do in a text,
right?
Or, thinking about a movement or thinking about a group of people who are looking for something to motivate them. And you find this and you say, this is part of our lineage. We just have to act on it. What do you think he was doing? Either or both and? Or
I think both and. I think both and. What's become really clear to me is the prescriptive, the like call to action.
Mm-hmm.
That has increased. So when I initially came across this text, his name is Matthew Trahela, by the way. I maybe should have named him earlier. And I can talk, maybe later we could talk about the extent to which he's the only one doing this and the extent to which he's part of a kind of broader intellectual network that he doesn't always name. But he, for a while, was saying this is something that we've lost and that we should do again, but wasn't getting much traction. I think he would point to, like, one of his favorite examples was Kim Davis, the county clerk, I believe in Kentucky, who went to jail because she refused to certify same-sex marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So he really likes her. But I had no evidence that she had ever read his text. I think he was just saying, oh, these are examples of what we should be doing. And here's these authoritative texts to back that up. Especially since COVID lockdowns, it has been taken up by people. This book and these ideas have been taken up by people as blueprints for their political action, both justification and a kind of how-to. He frequently sends copies of his book to like all the members of a particular state house. One of my favorite examples is that Mike Flynn is apparently really into this book. So there's one of the QAnon connections. And so it's operating but it as a blueprint is operating on all these levels. It's like the text his book is referring back to these older texts that have these ideas. His book as an object that gets sent to other people. And whether or not they're reading it is, I think, maybe beside the point or is not the whole point. You'll see videos, I've come across videos of people at school board meetings or county commissioner meetings holding up the book. And I think one thing that is similar between this kind of using it as a call to action and as a justification for action, one of the things that's similar between that move now and the initial Protestant context, I think, is this attempt to be both radical and not radical at the same time. So it's sort of like this is something, it's both like very bureaucratic and boring and leads to January 6th.
Right.
Like reading his book and reading the people who he's in dialogue with really helped me understand how could it be that people who are invested in law and order could be beating up the police on January 6th.
Right.
Yeah.
The same reason why the colonialists in early America could beat up the soldiers,
Exactly. And that, I mean, his investment in the connection between the French religious wars and then colonial America, skipping over a bunch of other stuff that happened in Europe, I think is something that I'm still working on tracing, but is really interesting to me.
Yeah, and it's almost the way that he evokes the origins story of Protestantism and the resistance of Protestantism is being recycled and used as a justification and call to action, as you said.
Exactly,
so, that's really interesting. So I think we've covered the motivation for Christian nationalists who use this sort of resistance theory. Do you think that the majority of Christian nationalists are interested in this sort of justification or grounding or theological worldview, or are they following without really, do they just need a few catchphrases from this stuff, and it's the leaders who are at the forefront of this thinking, or is it kind of a both and?
Yeah, again, I think it's both and. I think there are some people who really are reading the book and really are interested in finding this kind of both theological and historical justification and really kind of feeling that. And then I think there are other people who maybe, have heard talks by Trujillo and people who are interested in him and have taken up his ideas and who are less maybe invested in understanding that genealogy for themselves and more latch on to these catchphrases or terms. So one term that I've sort of been surprised that has caught on is the lesser magistrate. So because that's the key public official who is supposed to resist on behalf of the people. And then who can or can't be the public official or the lesser magistrate is always up for debate. But the idea that like in the contemporary United States, the term lesser magistrate is being used and mobilized is really fascinating to me because it seems to come from another time and it doesn't lose that valence. And I think that strange pastness is part of what's helpful about it politically for them. For example, so part of my research has been tracking on Twitter, now X, and other social media platforms when this term is used. So a few months ago, I think it was in January, was the height of the conflict between the state government of Texas and the federal government at the southern border. And Greg Abbott, the governor, was, openly saying, no, this is my jurisdiction as state governor, not federal jurisdiction. And all over social media, people were saying, great job, Greg Abbott. He's acting as a lesser magistrate. Sometimes linking to Trujillo's book, sometimes not.
Yeah.
And I found that across such a wide range of what I have been and others have been grouping into the category Christian nationalist, but also in like parents' rights advocates, people who are at varying degrees of connection, obvious connection with this set of ideas. Some of them would know where it's coming from, but I don't think all of, I think I would guess that the majority of people do not know that this is coming from 16th century.
You think?
I don't know. Like, maybe it would make me more employable if they did.
Demonstrating, right?
Exactly. Like, this is a kind of relevance for my research that is like intellectually really exciting, but so strange and not what I would have picked.
Yeah. Have you heard from him or any of his folks yet?
I haven't. I know a few. I have been contacted by investigative journalists who have talked to him and who are trying to talk to him. And a few of them have asked me, like, are you going to try to talk to him? And I have really mixed feelings about that. This is one of my really live methodological questions.
Yeah.
Do I need to talk to him? Or am I interested in him? Or am I interested in like the way that his ideas are being disseminated and picked up? I'm a little scared of him, I will say. I've also been in touch with representatives of PFLAG, a PFLAG group in Wisconsin. And they have told me that he and his followers came to one of their events and protested because they're so, and this group is so anti-queer, anti-gay. And the fact that that's, the fact that like that's happening, this is not theoretical for them. This is not like a kind of an intellectual question. For them, these ideas are having such an impact on the way that PFLAG now holds their meetings. Now they hold them over Zoom, or at least they did for a while. That has really struck me as something to be wary of. Yeah.
That raises a question for me about our role as academics in this whole cultural moment. The work that we do and that you're doing is really interesting and important to uncover those usages or misusages of the past. But how far do we go? Is this an academic exercise? Do we want or even envision our work having not the scale of impact that something like this pastor is doing, but is it an effective counterbalance to what's going on there? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question it's a really live question for me. And it's one reason why I was so happy to come here this week to think through some of these ideas with you all. I will say that I have decided I want to write this book as a public-facing book. I want it to, have a broader audience than a typical, I think it's going to have equal, if not more, interest to people who are outside of early modern French studies, for example. The question around this that I keep asking myself is like, what does it mean for me with my training and my scholarship to be talking about this guy? How is that different from someone who has experience in the John Birch Society, which he's connected to, or the right-wing militias in the United States? Like, what is it about knowing that these texts are coming from this specific context and really understanding that context? What does that bring to anything that I would say? Increasingly, I'm leaning towards it does bring something, not just because I want to write the book and I want the book to have an audience, but because I think this kind of, I think the theological underpinnings of this are getting kind of lost in some of the more mainstream reporting about it. Christian nationalists have been exposed, I think, more than they were, 2-3 years ago. I think there's been a lot of reporting and academic work about that, and I'm really happy about that. I think the worldview that comes from a kind of Calvinist understanding of the world, of salvation, of individual liberty, and what kind of individual liberty. Like a Calvinist understanding of individual liberty is very different from what, the average United States citizen thinks of. And I think trying to understand that, I think helps understand what the stakes are for debating with these people, or whether or not debate is even possible. I think that I have gone from, I've never had a can't we all just get along? I've been, but I have thought there's some potential here to have some dialogue. And increasingly, I continue to hope that that's the case. But I think the more that I've delved into the history of the way that he's using and deploying these texts and the way that these broader communities are, the more I think, no, they're actually interested in theocracy.
Yeah.
And they're not interested in pluralism.
Yeah.
And the way that, I think previously it was really easy for me to dismiss their claims to having their religious liberty violated as very silly. And I think understanding this historical context has made me not more sympathetic to it, but I understand the logic of it more. For someone like Kim Davis, signing off on a marriage certificate for a gay couple was promoting sin.
Right.
And for me, the question becomes, well, then how do you have a government job?
Right.
So that has really come to the fore for me. And I'm that's where I'm leaning towards, this kind of training and understanding of the lineage of Calvinist concepts. And not just Calvin, but primarily that's the root of this for me. Brings some different sense of what the stakes are than if I didn't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky question, how much we want to get into this world.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I'm aware of the problem of platforming him in particular.
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, I'm glad that more and more people know where this book is coming from and when they see the term lesser magistrate, what that's doing. But I think for him, all press is good press. And the idea that there's this lefty French professor who is reading his books and mad about it, I think that only is, I don't know. I'm not in his head, but I can imagine he's not too upset about it.
Yeah.
Part of, I think because of that issue of platforming, part of what my research has turned to more recently is looking at the ways that he did not originate this idea.
Right.
He didn't originate resistance theory, but he also didn't originate the idea that resistance theory was a part of the American heritage and the basis for some kind of Christian theocracy. That has much deeper roots. And so that gives me some satisfaction to contextualize his work not only within from the perspective of early modern France, but also within, the longer religious history of the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
no.
Welcome to my world.
Yeah,
it's not always a pleasant one.
Very tricky territory to get into, for sure. So I want to talk the last couple of things we'll talk about here. What part of what we do in exploring assumptions is to lift up voices of people doing interesting work that call into question dominant cultural assumptions. Can you point to some people in your circles who do this kind of work that we should be aware of going forward?
Yeah, that's great. You mean specifically scholarship?
Or it could be people who are, using scholarship in creative ways to, positively affect the way we think about things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, I admire a lot some of the historians and religious studies people who have been studying Christian nationalist circles.
Mm-hmm.
I think thinking about or related groups like Catherine Ballou's "Bring the War Home" is a book that I think is really important and helpful. She's a historian who tracks the history of right-wing militias and domestic terrorism in the United States, and that helped me understand January 6th in a new way. Kristen Kobes-Dumet, or Dumetz, depending on how she pronounces it, whose book Jesus and John Wayne, I think, has been really, really helpful, both for scholars interested in this field, but also for the broader public. Mm-hmm. I would love to say they're not in my circles, but I'm aware of their work, but I admire them a lot. Within the field of early modern France, the thing I think of most quickly is some of the people who are working on the long history of questions of race. Here's another example, I think, of where different terminology in different historical moments, while important to note, can sometimes get in the way of doing this kind of work where we're lifting up voices of people who have been marginalized within, the history of Western civilization. So Naomi Nadai is at University of Chicago, and her book is called Scripts of Blackness. And she's looking across early modern France, Spain, and England, which is a really interesting thing that doesn't often happen in early modern studies in and of itself, to be comparative in that way, and looking at the ways that race became attached to the ways that different kind of racial identities, particularly a Black racial identity, became attached to groups of people through performance cultures that had something to do with colonialism. Mm-hmm. I'm really not doing a great job describing her book. Her book is great. But one thing that has come up in the reception of her book within the field has been, well, the term race wasn't in existence in that way.
Yeah.
Race meant, family or bloodline, and not, it's the 19th century that really creates this idea of race in the way that we would use it now. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the really interesting things that Naomi does is say, no, this concept was there. We didn't call it race, but this concept was there. And here are the historically more salient terms that we can use to find that. Because I think the argument that race didn't exist at the time in the way that we think of it now has long been used across many fields to avoid studying questions of race. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I really admire her work.
Mm-hmm. That sounds similar to the way that anti-Semitism is studied, where, like race, it's a fairly modern term, but what was anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in other guises there earlier than the modern period?
Exactly. And, yeah. And I don't think that is at all antithetical to historicizing or being historically careful. I think those are methodological principles that go together.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Great. Well, finally, for all of those grad students and recent PhDs who are struggling to find their way in academia, do you have any advice or thoughts for them?
Well, this is a big question. This is a big question for me. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I would flippantly say keep reading the weird objects you're interested in, because who knows how relevant they'll be in 10, 20 years. Yeah. Hopefully in more politically positive ways. But more seriously, I do really believe in following one's intellectual, not even passion, but pleasure, to make sure that and that your mode is one of curiosity rather than like mastery of a field. I think so often, especially in graduate school, there's all this pressure to know all the things as if all the things could be known. And I think cultivating curiosity and pleasure in one's own work and that kind of interest in other people's work, I think can only serve you well, whether or not, you find your way in a traditional academic, whether or not your trajectory ends up being a traditional academic one or not.
Right. Yeah, I recently went to a conference via Zoom, which was a retirement conference for Fritz Graf, who's a very prominent classicist at the Ohio State University. And he, in his closing remarks, gave this really fun piece of advice, which was, don't follow a research agenda.
Yeah.
Don't map out your career.
Yeah.
Just follow, whatever comes up that's interesting to you, because you can go down roads you never thought you would and learn a tremendous amount about your field or your life or, interests you might not have ever thought you would follow through on.
Yeah.
And he has had a tremendously prolific career in classics, but also he's done some things on early Christianity and all across, both linguistically, philologically, culturally, religious studies. He's done a whole bunch of really interesting things.
I think that's great advice. Yeah.
So, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
It was wonderful to talk to you.
Likewise.
And thank you for such an engaging conversation on our first episode of this series.
I feel a little bit of pressure being the first, but I will accept it. Yeah. Thank you.
And good luck with your new work. And I hope it really does make a positive difference, not just in academic circles, but elsewhere.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota's Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures. Our recording engineer is Jonathan Prestrud at the College of Liberal Arts Language Center at the University of Minnesota. Visit futureofthepastlab.com to learn more about how we are rethinking the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity.